Hello, my name is Daniel Ross, and today on A Load of BS on Sport, we welcome former Premier League footballer and now highly sought after high performance coach and speaker. It's Paul McVeigh.
Growing up in Belfast in a really troubled time, that there were bombs going off, there was tanks driving down the street, there was essentially a civil war happening, absolute madness and chaos going on the plane across the Spurs to play with Jurgen Klinsmann. And then my first boss was Alan Sugar. Can we pay you some money to kick a ball around with your friends? And I'm like, yeah, that's great. And then Jurgen Klinsmann drove in a Volkswagen Beetle.
And with me, as always, recording with Paul today, it's Dan Biggar. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm all right, Dan. I'm a little bit, I don't know whether I've got a bit of the hay fever's kicking in here. I think the pollen is pretty high over here at the minute. So I'm actually battling away. You know what it's like for us men, Daniel, to battle away with a little bit of hay fever or man flu as it was. So I'm all right. I'm okay. Excited to chat to Paul actually today. I bet you are as well, considering he was one of your own.
He certainly played in a team which I grew up with, which was in the mid-90s, the team of Jurgen Klinsmann and Teddy Sheringham and Darren Anderton and all those guys who also won nothing, which of course is the story of our team's life. But yes, we'll dive into all that. I was wondering, before we bring Paul in, I mean, who are the psychologists around the teams that you played for, whether club or country?
So we had a gentleman called Andy McCann who was with us for a number of years with Wales. I mean, if I'm brutally honest, and I didn't actually use him personally myself a huge amount, but guys like Lee Halfpenny, George North, Sam Warburton, those guys would speak to him quite a lot actually and use him. He'd almost be like a bit of an agony aunt for Lee Halfpenny in particular after a tough result or a tough performance on the weekend. But he's just, I mean, it's interesting because he's obviously championing that, isn't he? And he's very much in that sort of frame of mind now. So it'll be really interesting to hear what he's got to say. So how was your week?
It's very nice. Yeah, I was out in the countryside for extended Easter break and got back late a couple of days ago after a long car journey with the kids. Actually, last night I'm also feeling on the ropey-ish side, but no excuses. I went to a sports industry awards bash, and we had a lot of fun. And in fact, by the way, we bumped into Jason Kenny, who we've been talking about getting on this podcast, and we harangued him as soon as he got on stage. And then we had a good chat with him and his agent as well. So hopefully we've snagged a future podcast guest in the bargain as well. But as far as Paul goes, I'm interested to see whether he is going to turn your mind a little and convince you of the value of mental strength and psychology.
Mental performance, I think he calls it, doesn't it?
Mental performance, that's the one, exactly.
Yeah. So exactly. Let's see what he's got to say.
Let's get him in. Welcome to you, Paul McVeigh. It's great to see you. How are you and where do we find you today?
Embarrassingly well. Daniel, thanks for having me. Good to meet you, Dan. And I'm in Manchester in the UK. I've been over in England for the last 30 years. When I left Belfast as a 16-year-old kid, and I'm sure already you're probably doing the maths or looking going 30 plus 60. Well, I'm actually 47, even though I look like a 14-year-old child. But yes, been in Manchester now for the last few years, so enjoying life in sunny Manchester today.
Your accent hasn't changed, Paul, in fairness. You haven't quite got the Manc accent yet, or the Northern accent in you just yet, anyway.
Pot kettle from your side, was it not?
Fair play.
French accent coming out there, is it? It's like, you know what? It's probably the only thing my parents give me, because even, being a professional athlete for nearly 20 years was despite my genes, not because of my genes, because in our family, we look at a bar of chocolate and put on about half a stone. So it definitely was nothing to do with that side. And you can't see this on a podcast like this, but I'm only 5'6", so everything against me that could have come from my gene pool being a top athlete.
Well, you're wearing a black T-shirt, which is very sensible of you, looking incredibly svelte and in great shape. So nothing to fear. Now, listen.
I'm into this because I actually have just stopped drinking in the last year, and I fast 1 day a week for 36 hours. So that might come into the conversation. But anyway, we'll see where it goes.
Well, we'll see where we go. But going back to your first career, you made 273 professional football appearances, if I'm not mistaken, mainly for Norwich City, a few for my very own special Tottenham Hotspur. And in fact, the season when you played was the season I really got into it. I was a junior Spur buying £8 tickets, sitting at the Paxton Road end, down in the first few rows of the lower tier, with the Klinsman Sheringham season and all the craziness of that year. But because you also capped 11 times by Northern Ireland, but you are in a way a rarity as an ex-top footballer to become a psychologist, to study psychology, to build a second career in that sphere and in working in high performance as a coach and a speaker. Because we know that at the elite level, much of performance is in the mind. Were you a big thinker as a player?
Well, I suppose the starting point of that answer is no. By the end of the career, I would say I would have hoped so. And ultimately it comes from growing up in Belfast in a really, really troubled time that, I didn't realize it when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s that there was essentially a civil war happening. And for whatever reason, when I came across the London and suddenly around all these, what I considered very flash, very confident young Londoners, that I didn't actually realize I had a massive inferiority complex. Now that could be my size. I'm only 5'6", as I mentioned, but it could be for a lot of reasons. And I didn't even realize it. So it was one of the things that probably was holding me back. And I really needed to work on, but I ultimately didn't even realize that I had this issue. And I've told this story actually quite a few times before. It was actually a friend of a friend who just randomly, it was actually quite close to my birthday in December, but he gave me a book, and essentially it was by a guy called Tony Robbins, Anthony Robbins, so a big personal development guru. And he said, listen, I think you should read this. And it was a bit of a kind of life-changing moment for me, because from never having any understanding of anything to do with mindset or psychology to suddenly not only getting this book, and we can talk about all the different possible permutations of what could have happened of getting that book. I could have, said no thanks, could have taken it and thrown it into the corner, could have taken it, read it, and done nothing with it. But actually, it was the fourth option that actually occurred, and that was I read it, completely blew my mind, and then started applying these principles of personal development to my life, in both in professional football and in my own personal life. And it just completely put me on a different direction in life. And I think it was probably the catalyst of why, 30 years later, I've ended up in this space of, as you say, working in this performance psychology space. I still work with, I've worked with different Premier League teams, still currently working with a championship team. And it's just the subject that I'm most passionate about in life. I just love it, mostly because I've benefited from it. And that's probably quite a selfish reason. But once you start talking about it and sharing it with other people, ultimately it always applies to every single person in the world. And it's, your life is a direct relation of what's happening in your head.
If the Tony Robbins book was a catalyst for you in a very positive way, describe the Paul McVeigh before reading that book and what your mindset was like, why you were suffering from some imposter syndrome, what was going on, what was the context around that, and then how did you start to change, and how did it really then affect you as a person and as a performer?
Yeah. Should I lie down on my couch here? Do you want me to?
Actually, yeah. You might hire me at the end of this. I'm really getting into it.
Send me the invoice for
yeah.
No, I'd say it's so deep rooted in society, and and I'll probably just put it into the generic, in the kind of, if you grew up in a kind of a Celtic nation and a Celtic society, we probably were always, whether consciously or subconsciously, quite having that inferior against English people. The fact that I've sort of grew up in a war zone where the people within my area, within my world, were outwardly fighting the British government. There were bombs going off, there was tanks driving down my street, there was all sorts of stuff happening. Just have to go back, through a couple of generations of my family, and even my dad being the youngest of one of 10 kids, and all his older brothers and sisters all went to America to get a better life, because essentially you couldn't get a job or a good job being a Catholic. The amount of my uncles and aunts who left school with the best kind of, O levels, A levels back in the day, and I ended up working in a biscuit factory because your name was a Catholic name. All of these things that were going against you for so long, probably the reason why you did feel a bit of an inferiority complex. But yes, it could have been Messiahs, could have been the Irish, could have been the Irish Catholic thing, could have been the, walking into a pub back in the day and there was like no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So many reasons why that happened. But ultimately, whatever it was, I came across to England, probably not fully believing in myself. And as you mentioned, the guy right at the start of meeting on my first day at Tottenham Hotspur, Jurgen Klinsmann, because his first day signing the club in 1994 was my first day joining as a youth team player and an apprentice. And I suppose for all of the other London lads and people who who were with me in the team that day, playing with a World Cup winner, an absolute global megastar like Jurgen Klinsmann, he just starred in the USA '94 World Cup, and suddenly you're training with him. It must have been amazing for everyone else, but in my head, I was looking at this guy who was just an absolute, icon of the game, and thinking, well, if that's what it takes to be, like a professional footballer, a Premier League footballer, or an international footballer, there's no way in the world someone like me is ever going to be able to do that. And that probably really cemented this, you call it imposter syndrome or lack of belief in myself. And that's why I didn't even realize what I was doing to myself for this first year until I read the book. And then I was then consciously aware that I had an issue, and I realized I needed to start working on my belief system, which is, it wasn't something I nailed in a weekend or over the next season even. It's, it's probably a constant challenge, because I suppose now what I've learned is that we're all self-limiting. We're all will limit what we believe we're capable of. And, finance is a good example. Whatever money someone might be earning, just say you're on, pick a figure, say someone's on 50 grand a year and they lose their job. That person, when they're going for the next job, probably not going to go for a £500,000 a year job. They're probably going to go for a 55 grand a year, because they're putting the limit of that's what you're a 50 grand a year kind of guy or girl. So that's the limits that we place on ourselves. And ultimately what I've found is that we are all self-limiting. I suppose the question is, do your limits allow you to achieve your goals in life?
Paul, how was Jurgen Klinsmann with you guys as youngsters? Did you see it? I know you said you sort of felt a little bit inferior and arriving on the same day as him, but did you see it as a real opportunity? And why I asked what was he like with you guys, because for me, when I started in 2007, 2008, Shane Williams had just been named World Player of the Year. And I remember sitting in the front garden with my mum, and I was sort of saying like, "Oh, that's how am I supposed to go in and be, I suppose, be in the same room or share the same field or dressing room as Shane Williams?" And she sort of said to me, she said like, "How many people in your position would give their right arm to go and share a changing room with Shane Williams or share a pitch and play with him and train with him, etc." And Shane was absolutely magnificent in terms of passing on and being welcoming, etc., etc. So I was just wondering, how was Jurgen to you guys in that sense, and how did you see it as an opportunity, or was it a little bit, like you said, very much almost scared walking around there with him?
Yeah, it was intimidating, and it was nothing to do with Jurgen. Of course, this is always the case, and this is why I love psychology. It's never the person that's having the impact or the effect. It's always projection. It's just me, placing my belief system and my filters of what's happening internally on the people around you. And of course, that's where probably the majority of conflicts and miscommunication happen in the world, because I see life like this, someone else sees it like this, and they generally don't match up to the beliefs that we have. But Jurgen was an absolute gentleman. He couldn't be a more humble guy. And the perfect example is the car he drove in on that day. I actually turned up and I knew the likes of the Teddy Sheringham's, who just won the Golden Boot the previous season, who was the top striker at Spurs. We had Sol Campbell, who of course went on to be like an invincible with Arsenal, and amazing England player. You had Darren Anderton's, Nicky Barbie, all these like top players who are all coming in their, SL Mercedes or Range Rovers or whatever the cars they were bringing in. And Jurgen Klinsmann drove in a Volkswagen Beetle. Now, if that doesn't just show the humility and just how modest he was. And I don't know what would, but, and what's interesting, the kind of the players I was around over the next kind of 20 years or so, you know, whether it was someone like a Jurgen or a Teddy Sheringham, or whether it happened to be someone like Les Ferdinand or David Ginola, who was just an absolute, you know, global superstar, not just from the football side, they were all the nicest people you would ever meet. So it's not down to the fact that what they were like to me, it's what I was like in front of them. And actually, it's a great point that your mum makes. And I thought you were going to say probably what I wish someone had said to me that she said to you. Yes, it's a great opportunity. Yeah, we can all see that. And lots of people would love to be in that position. But I suppose what would have been even more helpful if someone had turned around and said, you're not supposed to be the same as Jurgen Klinsmann. You're not supposed to be at their level. Why would you compare yourself to him?
Because he was already, I mean, he was the finished article at that point, wasn't he? In terms of, you know, World Cup winner, global star, yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's that. I think you want to be him, don't you? You want to be him on day one as a young footballer, sports person, etc. You want to be your Jurgen Klinsmanns, your Ronaldos, your Messis, your Shane Williams, your Carters, etc. But I think you make a really good point, Paul. That somebody should say, well, no, you're not going to be him yet. You know what I mean? So it's a really good point that you make. And did you take? Do you think you made the most of the opportunity from learning from those guys, Paul, when you were there?
No, I don't know. I would probably say a little. I would like to say a lot, but it would probably in reality would have been a little. And I don't even know why this happened, because I probably did have a real curiosity streak. Might have been from my dad and the things he would have, you know, done as we were growing up and kids, of just, you know, start talking about different subjects that might have been really interesting, like the distance to the sun, or how long it takes to get from the sun, a beam of light, to the earth, or what, anything that was I didn't know, and he'd share this kind of information. So there was a bit of a let's be curious about life. And I think I had a little bit of it in me. So I used to remember, you know, in my first year as a professional, before I'd actually made my debut at Spurs in the Premier League. And it was just after Euro 96. And I remember sitting in pre-season training as a first year pro, sitting with Teddy Sheringham, and he just obviously starred in Euro 96, you know, with him and Alan Shearer up front in that amazing competition for England, and just talking about what was it like hitting the penalty against Germany in the semi-final, because he stuck it at the top corner. You know, I was like, what were you feeling? How all of these things, all the way through to even now with some of the work we do in our football business speakers, and bringing in the biggest names of football to try and share their experience of world-class performance with the corporate world. And I actually, as a 21-year-old kid, was so interested, and probably wasn't right at the start of my career, but so interested in learning from these people, that I went out of my way to go and try and get a lunch with Gianfranco Zola, just because I ended up meeting someone who worked with him at Chelsea. And then he asked Gianfranco, could this wee Irish dude who's up in Norwich come down and take you for a lunch on the King's Road? And Gianfranco went, yeah, no problem. And I went down and met him, considering he was probably 34, 35 at the end of his illustrious career. And I was thinking, what do you do? How do you hit free kicks? What do you do to stay fit at 34? How do you still play in the Premier League? All of these. Then I realized that Gianfranco played with Maradona at Napoli, and that's a funny story. And I was like, what was Maradona like? Was he the best player in training? Did he always practice his free kicks and finishing? And he was like, no, he didn't really come to training. I was like, what do you mean he didn't come to train? He's the best player in the world. And he goes, yeah, he just kind of didn't turn up for training, played on a Saturday, scored a hat trick, took the match ball, and went back out again for another few days. But it was that, you know, if you're the absolute best of the best, you don't have to, you know, train like the rest of us mere mortals. But it was that real fascination as I started to learn and mature and realize just how hard it was to compete at this level, and realizing that from, you know, probably 19 or 20, technically I'm probably not going to improve a huge amount. You know, they're probably mostly you stay roughly where you are. And I think in the technical space, physically, I was never going to be a Peter Crouch who played with 6'7", always going to be 5'6". But I did feel that one area that just almost was limitless of where you could learn about, improve, apply to your game, was that mindset psychology piece, which is why when I did finally make my debut in my first year as a youth team, or as a first year pro at Spurs, the first thing I did when I came back was go and seek out a sports psychologist so I could try and learn and improve in that area. Not because my career had suddenly gone downhill, I just made my debut. It was because of what else can I do to improve and try and have that longevity in a really ruthless environment.
There's something about you, just I'm sort of hypothesizing, and you can knock this down because I'm just getting to know you in 20 minutes. As much as you were clearly ambitious and you were still, relatively speaking, playing at a high elite level, even though you went from Spurs to Norwich, but there's something of you which is almost the voyeur, which is that as much as obviously you had dreamed of playing a lot for Spurs, there was more of you even at that age, which was fascinated about going for lunch with Zola to learn from him. And that might have been as much about how do I improve myself, but it seems somehow more about learning about mindset. And as you did talking to Teddy about, this is sort of what was it like question. It sort of fascinated you from such a young age. And I sort of wonder whether you were sort of better off. You needed to go, dare I say, down a small level to a club like Norwich. It sort of suited your demeanor better to feel more comfortable there. Maybe that's it. Maybe who knows? Because if you'd managed to stay at Spurs, maybe you would have settled into that and you could have had a career quite reasonably in a top five club, but that wasn't to be. And I wonder whether that's just coincidence or whether you think that you kind of found your level, both from an ability point of view, but almost somehow psychologically you were more comfortable in that sort of environment. And yeah.
Possibly. I know where you're going with that. I know what you're trying to say. There was probably two things. One is, I would say that it definitely wasn't me wanting to leave Spurs. It was more a reality check. It was, Paul, your technical level, your physicality, your all-round game is not to be in the top 6 in the teams in the Premier League. You are a championship player. And of course, it's like I could tell you any reason why I should have been a better player. You are where you are. And there's a reason why I played the majority of my games in the league below the Premier League. And I think that even when I went there, I had this probably arrogance or maybe a little bit of ignorance because you were at a Premier League club for 6 years thinking, I'm going to go to Norwich City and I'm going to walk into this team. And Dan, you'll appreciate this one because I went there and there was a 17-year-old Craig Bellamy. And suddenly I'm looking at this kid going, oh my God, this is the best young player I've ever seen, and couldn't get into the Norwich City first team because Bellers was in front of me. And of course, within a few months, he's then signed back into the Premier League for £6 million, which was obviously a lot of money for a young kid at the time. And then his strike partner at Norwich was another Welsh guy called Ewan Roberts, who'd scored over 200 goals. He's nearly scored more goals than games I played in my career. That's how good he was. So the ignorance of me going, I'm just going to walk into this Norwich City team and not having a sniff because I wasn't performing at that level. I think that ultimately kind of sums up where I was. And then I realized I just had to keep improving and keep getting better and better. And probably, Daniel, just the other point of what you were mentioning, that possible scenario. I think one of the things of why the Tony Robbins book did just change my life so completely is that because he said, whatever it is you're doing in life, you're probably not the first to do it. And I think that really stuck with me because I don't have to reinvent the wheel of being a professional footballer. I just need to replicate what other top players are doing. So whether that was why I wanted to speak to Teddy, why I wanted to go and learn from Gianfranco Zola, or why whatever it was I was doing through my career, it was, if I can do what other people are doing, then I'm going to have roughly the same level of outcome in my life. And unfortunately, that wasn't happening at Norwich. And then it came at different scenarios. I'm not achieving the goals that I want based on the behaviors that I'm currently displaying. So what needs to change? A goal can't change because that's set. I want to be a top player. I want to play for a long time. So the behaviors need to change, which is ironically why I mentioned I've just stopped drinking a year ago. When I was 21, I also stopped drinking for 2.5 years because I was not playing in the team as often as I wanted. And I thought, I need to change something drastically in my life to achieve my goals. And so alcohol was a very, very easy get that out of the way and try and get into the team. And then I did it for 2.5 years. And then I had a choice to make in life. Do I want to go through the rest of my career and never have another night out with my teammate or a drunken night out with my teammates? And I actually made the conscious choice to say, do you know what? I'm actually going to start drinking again to try and enjoy myself because I didn't enjoy my life as much. And maybe that says more about me than anything else, but I didn't enjoy myself as much when I was not drinking.
Paul, at what stage did you in your career? Sorry, did you read that book?
I was 17, so it was November 1995.
Okay, and would you advise a lot more modern footballers this day and age to sort of look at something like that or something very similar to give them a bit of a different perspective in life, in football, in sport, etc.
Because ultimately what the book was about, you can put it into any category. You can put it into personal development, you can put it into self-help, you can put it into mindset or psychology, but really what it was human function. This is the way that people operate around the world. Doesn't really matter who you are, where you grew up, what you do. This is what people and how we do things. You essentially have all this stuff going on in your head. And the fact that you've got it all going on in your head, because I grew up pretty much in a war zone, I'll have all this stuff going on in my head. You grew up not in a war zone in Wales, but you probably had lots of trouble growing up because of the area you grew up in. So you'll have a different, let's say, belief system to me. And Daniel, again, will have a very different belief system. But we're all then navigating our lives based on how we think what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, what's acceptable and unacceptable. But of course, it's only to us. So then we have to try and apply our beliefs into the life. And then, of course, everything that's happening here will dictate how you feel every day. And without going into the session, and maybe I need to send you an invoice after this. But it's like, then, of course, how you feel every single day is going to dictate what you do. And of course, what you do, Dan, no better example. How you feel every day going onto the training field is going to dictate whether you're the best player in training or the worst player in training. And if you can go and feel the way that's going to make you the best player in training every day or consistently for a long time, you're going to end up with a very different set of outcomes than if you go and be the worst player in training. It's just really simple human function, but it doesn't matter about whether you're a sportsman, woman, athlete. It's just simply how we do things in the human race.
I wonder with you, Paul, and this is a sample size of one, so this is not a statistically significant thesis, but you were a very good player, but you weren't at a sort of Klinsmann, Ronaldo level, and so perhaps you had to work extra hard to get up. That's not to diminish how bloody hard all the brilliant players work, because they do so as well. But it made me kind of think that you made this transition into a kind of academic, certainly thoughtful world after your sporting career. And if you look at the modern trend in football management, it's more for coaches and managers who often didn't also have what you might call stellar careers, but have a more of an academic mindset. I mean, you can actually go back as far as Wenger and Mourinho, certainly as rarities at the time. But now you might look at Eddie Howe, Graham Potter, Nagelsmann, Tuchel, Hertzler at Brighton, and there are others. I mean, what do you think changed about the way clubs have been recruiting their managers and coaches over the last 10 plus years?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually. I think it's just to having an understanding of people. I think before it was an understanding of the game and of coaching, and actually now it's a complete, how do you bring it all together? Not every club will have a sporting director or technical director who can look after recruitment and all of the other aspects of the club that's necessary. I think for a modern day manager or coach, they have to be across everything. It's like, what's our sports science department like? What's our health and nutrition like? What's our recovery like? What's our coaching like? What's our recruitment like? What's our analysis? And for someone to be that interesting with the managers I've worked with in the last season, they're almost like CEOs of big companies because everything lands on their desk at every part of the department, from being media savvy to then going and doing an AGM to then managing up to the board and, all of these things. It really takes a very, very astute, switched on person. And of course, you have to get results at the same time while all this is happening. Pretty much good luck, and it's the reason why I didn't want to go into that word.
Yeah, I think your stress levels, and that's why you look so good. I think, Paul, for your age currently, there's not many managers out there who are looking particularly healthy and happy and young in life, for sure. But give us a bit of a comparison of maybe some managers that you worked with in your career, because I was interested. I listened to the podcast you did with Ben Foster the other, I think, whatever it was, a couple of weeks ago or months ago, and it was almost like you guys landed on basically you have to be either, I think it was almost like a full blown narcissist you have to be, or you have to basically have the understanding and empathy for every single person or player type of thing. There was almost sort of no mid ground type of thing. Were there any examples of those guys in your career, or anybody who stood out to you when you were playing?
I actually think every coach and manager I ever played with always down the kind of the narcissist, and sure they had a few dead bodies under their patio and stuff. It's just like so full of themselves, and they were always right, and they had to do it their way, and it's like they couldn't be wrong, and they couldn't show any weakness and vulnerable, and it's like, yes, I appreciate it's 2025, so people operate in a very, very different way, but it was just that lack of warmth and lack of ability to really fully engage and just understand. It's funny, I was actually talking about this yesterday with a corporate client. I talked about how we had a manager, and he was called Nigel Worthington when I was at Norwich City. And the fact that he was from Northern Ireland, the fact that he'd gone through his career and came out as a coach and then became the manager, and his way of essentially releasing me from Norwich City was to sit me down in his office with a big smile on his face and tell me that he's letting me go. Now, just for a whole variety of reasons why that was just so inappropriate and out of place. And then because I'm top scorer in the reserves, but like what I said with Ewan Roberts and Craig Bellamy, I think I'm doing well. I'm probably just waiting for my opportunity, thinking I've got a chance. And because I'm going in with this, I think like I'm going to get in the team, as opposed to he's giving me the meeting to say, here's the door, you need to move on. And because I was in such shock when he told me that, I need to find another club. And my question was, but like, why are you letting me go? And his answer was, because I don't think you have what it takes. Like, even if you think that, why would you say that to somebody? It's just such a complete lack of understanding, and he was so self-centered and narcissistic, and he's so up his own arse that he didn't have the empathy to go, this kid's career has literally gone down the Swanee. I could probably be a little bit nice to him and say, oh, you're just not my kind of player. I want to talk, whatever it was, like George Graham did when I left Spurs. I want someone who's 6'3" to be my striker, not a 5'6". I'm like, that's okay. I can't do anything with that. That's fine. I'm not your type of player. I only need to find one manager out of the 92 clubs that I am their type of player. I can deal with that. Not, I don't think you have what it takes. And that just probably sums up the kind of the difference of the way coaches and managers are today versus what they were back in the day.
How did you bounce back from that, Paul? Because like you said, it's pretty hard hitting, that, isn't it? Like you said, you can get on board with not being 6'3" or not being left-footed, right-footed, whatever the reasons are. How did you bounce back from that meeting?
It's funny. I probably wouldn't be having this conversation if it hadn't happened. What actually transpired. So that happened on the Monday morning. By the Friday, I actually got a call from the manager, and he said, listen, trying to phone me up like I'm his best mate. Listen, man, we've had a few injuries this week, so I'm going to need you to be sub for the game. And I'm obviously, spitting feathers down the phone, like, but of course, Norwich said they were paying me, so I had to be professional. And I, I thought, right, okay, I'll turn up, I'll be sub for the game against Watford at home. Stay, not going to play, just making up the numbers. Anyway, so game started. We ended up after 70 minutes 1-0 down, and completely out of the blue, and with not expecting it, Worthington turned around to me and went, "Wee man, you're going on." And I'm obviously like, "Who are you talking?" Because you're not talking to me. You must be talking to someone else because I'm not involved really. And he goes, "Go on." So anyway, with 20 minutes remaining in this game, and probably feeling quite, a little bit sad, a little bit excited, but also quite philosophical about it, thinking, I've only played a couple of times for Norwich City at this point in my career. It's a lovely stadium, 25,000 people. I thought, if I'm never going to play at this stadium again, I think I'm going to try my best and go out with a bang. And it was one of those moments in life where as soon as I got on the pitch, I just felt like a kind of man possessed. And every time I got the ball, I was just running at the right. I was playing left midfield, just running at the right back. In the first couple of minutes, I went past the defender, had like kind of left foot 40-yard diagonal cross. Our right winger come in, head the ball in, 1-1. And then in the last minute, same thing happened. Went past a couple of players, whipped in a cross, and big Ewan Roberts scores for 1-2 2-1. Now, do you know that feeling, Dan, where you're about to lose the game, last minute, kind of snatch the victory out of the jaws of defeat? And it was amazing feeling, buzzing, got hairs on my arm sticking up now just thinking about it. But of course, I'm leaving the club on the Monday, and I've gone into the change room, everyone's celebrating. There was beers and all the time back in the early 2000s. So everyone's buzzing. I'm clearly not buzzing because I know I'm leaving. So I managed to go into the showers, get changed. And as I'm walking back out with my tracksuit on, about to walk out the door, the changing room door's here and the manager's here, standing getting changed next to it. And as I'm walking past him, he kind of puts his arm out and stops me. I kind of looked at him. And this, for me, sums him up. He looked at me in the eye, and as he's kind of doing a shirt and tie, and then he looks down at the ground and he was like, you did well out there, man. Just come in on Monday, get your head down, and let's work hard. And that was the kind of turning point in my career where I'm like, wow, I'm never, ever, ever going to let someone dictate to me how I feel ever in this life. Because yes, he might not think I'm a good player. He might not, any other feelings he has about me, but the actual question whether I have what it takes to do something, I'm like, I'm not only going to prove him wrong, I'm going to prove everyone wrong. And then, of course, I went on, played 40 games the next season, then won the league the next season, playing the Premier League, and all these things that happened. But ultimately, it could easily have gone the other way. I don't get that call. I never play against Watford, and I've never played a professional footballing career.
Small margins. Of course, the title of your book, which we mustn't forget, but in all seriousness, is it's quite bold. It's The Stupid Footballer is Dead. Maybe the sequel is The Stupid Manager is Dead, or something like that. Maybe that's your sequel. But what did you mean by that title? Why did you feel the need to write that book?
Well, I suppose it was always that I thought it was a misconception of what people thought footballers were like. It was I'd be having conversations wherever it happened to be, whether it was in Norwich, in London, in Belfast, and as you're having this conversation, it might come out, that you play football or whatever, or maybe they know you play football and they're speaking to you. And after, say, a couple of minutes of chatting, and someone would kind of give you that, kind of their head kind of tips to the side and a bit of a look, and they're like, you're quite intelligent, which I think is a nice compliment. And of course, the caveat comes for a footballer. I'm like, why does that come in? Why just give me a nice compliment? Don't have to say for all of the stupid footballers you think of. And so I've always had that. I actually think it's the opposite. I'm sure it's the same in rugby, Dan. Like you cannot pull the wool over footballers or rugby guys. They are so astute. They're so bright. And the reason why is because they're in a certain environment that literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of people come up to you every year. And once you get that much attention, you very, very quickly work out whether this person's genuine and they just want to come up and say hello and an autograph or a smile, or they're looking something. And so that whole kind of footballers are stupid. Now, I don't really care whether it's an academic thing or not. I just think the ability to perform and operate at that level, whether it's professional football, rugby, whatever you're doing, I just think it's completely a misconception. And so the book was to try and prove that, that not all footballers were stupid. And of course, 20 years later, or actually had the title of the book when I was 21, which was 20 odd years ago. And I thought that, but now, there's just so many examples, you could pick Gary Neville off the top of your head. Just think of what Gary Neville's done after his career, the businesses he's built and all the stuff he's done all the way through to Matthew Flamini, who I think is a billionaire after his biochemical company too. Just the amount of examples one of my former teammates who was at Norwich City with me in my last year when I went back for a second spell, called Tom Adiemi, is currently at Harvard Business School doing his MBA. I'm like, there's just so many examples of it. It's just that people still see a certain player on the back or front page of a tabloid magazine and go, "Oh yeah, all players are like that."
Yeah. I think you said was it the bullshit detector has to be right on point with footballers and sports people potentially. How different is it now, Paul, that you're working in the more sort of high performance and a corporate-y sort of world? How do you deal with those individuals? How do you coach them to maybe overcome the self-doubt potentially like you had, or if their bosses are having similar conversations with them like you had in Nigel Worthington's office? How do you deal with those guys compared to sports people, footballers, whatever it may be?
I think they're always in the same ballpark of why they're having these issues. It generally comes down to a kind of confidence thing, or a belief thing, and that's mostly the reason why. It's a lot of the time, it's a bit like, why does Usain Bolt have a coach? Because it's not that he needs to be taught how to do this every single time. It's just that kind of support and be able to go, if you're at the track you're on for, world class performance or elite performance, for lots of different reasons, anybody can just slightly veer off that course and that path. And of course, if you do it day after day, you very quickly come way away from your goal. So a lot of the time is that just kind of reinforcement and support to go, this is the right way, you can do this, because we all have that self-doubt. It's very human to do it. Interestingly, the way my business has evolved, when I stopped playing in 2010 and I started working as a keynote speaker, it's allowed me to kind of open up this conversation around, listen, if I do a keynote speech for your company of whatever, 500, 1,000 people, it might be a great starting point, but it's not the entire program. So now we actually deliver long-term leadership programs, which allows us to bring in, the people who have gone and done all their executive coaching badges, to bring in the facilitators, the trainers, the other keynote speakers, which for me is really important. I realized, okay, yeah, I have a USP of the only guy that's played in the Premier League with a master's in psychology, but that is just a strand of elite performance. What about, well, in your world, Dan, what about Rugby World Cup winners? People who have been at the highest level in Europe. What about Olympic champions? What about people who've won other, world titles in sport? So, but again, sport is only one pillar of what we offer. Because then you think, if we're going into the corporate world, you really need people who have been there, seen and done, in their shoes, in the trenches with them. So then you need to find business leaders who have run multi-billion-dollar organizations. Military is another great way to really engage people, because if you bring in a US Navy SEAL or a fighter jet pilot or whoever you're bringing in, again, people are putting their life on the line for doing their job, all the way through to academics, world explorers. So because we've built up this, what I call a world-class roster in our business of the Leadership Club, it allows us to go, here's this amazing group of world-class performers who are going to be the best fit, so that we can try and engage your senior teams to take you on this journey of high performance.
Interesting, talking about your work as a keynote speaker. And this is perhaps a little leading question to invite you to go into a little more detail about how you operate, because there is a risk, if you're focusing on doing these big keynotes, that you get trapped in soundbite, whereas what you really need to do is move from there into kind of real micro improvement. And also, I think often with keynotes particularly, there is tendency towards some survivorship bias of the stories that people are telling, which is not to say, I'm sure you're not only telling stories with like very happy endings, but how are you tangibly implementing or helping executives to implement change in their lives and careers beyond the big set piece?
Yeah, well, that's the whole reason why we have our leadership club, which is long-term leadership development. So again, I was asked so many times over the 15 years of working with Microsoft or Cisco or PwC or Rolls-Royce or Invest, whoever it is, whatever the company is, doesn't really matter, around the world. And because my topics that I talk on almost follow a football and career. So again, without sounding like a dick, for me to play in the Premier League, I had to be in the 0.00001% of the population of the world to do that. Because if you think of, no disrespect, Dan, but like where I grew up, everybody was just playing football. Not many people were playing rugby. Of course, in the south of Ireland, it was much bigger, but the whole of Northern Ireland was just football. But then you think of all the kids across UK, Ireland, all playing football. And then you can think across the world, not just Europe, America, Africa, Asia. So the millions, if not billions of kids who wanted to be a professional footballer. And of course, they don't want to be a professional footballer in their country like me. I wanted to go to England to play in the Premier League because it's the richest, most prestigious league. So for me to do that, I had to ultimately be one of the best performers in the world because of that, the amount of people trying to do it. And then once you do that for whatever, 100, 200, maybe 300 times, you then become one of the leaders in the team. So actually then you need to talk about leadership. And of course, being in the team background, that teamwork is so key. So all of those three subjects are pretty big subjects in and of themselves, which is why I really focus on what my passion is and the thing I'm most enthusiastic about, which is the psychology. So it's always, what's the psychology of performance? What's the psychology of leadership? What's the psychology of teamwork? And what that does, it starts the conversation, Daniel. You don't go, let me come in, listen to me for 45 minutes and I'm going to change your world. But what it does do is comes in I come in 45 minutes and I'm going to completely disrupt your world and make you think about the things that you probably haven't thought about before. Because the way that, I was going to say world class, and I wouldn't put myself in that category, but the way elite performers operate is very different towards 99% of the public. So when you get an understanding of the way you need to do things and how people do them, and actually, ironically, I don't really talk about myself on a keynote. Everything I talk about is always about the theory and how we actually apply it. And yes, there'll be some examples, but give an example. Playing against Cristiano Ronaldo as I was, so it was 2004, I must have been about 25, 26. I think he was about 17 or 18. And he, for me, is one of the best examples I can use around the psychology of performance. Because I put up a photograph of him at Man United, me at Norwich City, and I'm saying to the audience, whoever I'm speaking in front of, do you think Cristiano Ronaldo was one of the two best players in the world when he was a 17-year-old kid? And of course, he wasn't. That conversation generally happens for the last 10 years, him or Messi, him or Messi. But even in that United team, he probably wasn't even in the top 10 best players because it was Rooney and Roy Keane, Rio Ferdinand and Scholes. Anyway, so I'm like, well, how does he go from being this 17, 18-year-old kid to literally being either the best or the second best player in the world? Don't really care what your opinion is, but he's right at the pinnacle of what I would consider the most competitive industry on the planet. And no matter who I speak in front of, whether it's 500 CEOs, 500 nurses, 500 accountants, whatever it is, inevitably the people come back and go, it was his discipline, his hard work, it was dedication, desire, his belief, his confidence or arrogance, whatever you want. And it all comes back to, well, where is it all happening? And everyone eventually realized it was his mindset. And all I'm doing really, it's like, I feel like I'm almost like a lawyer in a courtroom, just building a case of going, this is kind of one of the things that I did. Here's one of the examples of one of the best athletes ever and what they do and why they think it's about psychology, because my entire career was about psychology. We take two teams competing against each other. What's the difference? And I'll give them an example based on a 4-corner model of performance with technical, physical, psychological, and social. And invariably people say it's down to the psychology for the teamwork. So you're going, okay, so for me, it was about psychology. For Ronaldo, it's about psychology. For teams, it's about psychology. And then you throw it back to them and go, so how much stuff are you doing to improve your psychology? And let me tell you, that is where the tumbleweed suddenly comes into the room and just kind of blows out the other side, because everyone's like, I think I get around it at some stage and I'm like, yeah, it's running your life. You just don't realize that it's actually doing it.
Paul, I heard you. I think that's fascinating, because I think I heard you say on the same podcast that you said that basically anytime there was sort of like, whether it's a footballing schedule or a business schedule, etc., it was like whenever the first thing to get cut off the schedule was maybe the psychology session or the hour session of psychology, and it was like deemed the least important rather than weights, team session, swimming session, whatever it is. So I think that translates really well into, especially now, what you're doing in terms of the business and the corporate world. I wanted to just build on what you said about your sort of dream, and that small 0.0001% of people who wanted to not just be a professional footballer, but they wanted to play in the Premier League because it was deemed the best, the richest, the most exclusive, etc. When you go into sort of clients, like I think Microsoft is one that you mentioned, do people in Microsoft realize how lucky, or do they think that they're in that 0.00% because they're working for Microsoft as a sense, compared to Cristiano Ronaldo working for Man United or, Real Madrid, etc.? Does that question make sense in terms of, do they realize how lucky they are working in their field?
Yeah, it absolutely does make sense. And it's interesting you ask that, because one of my opening gambits whenever I'm speaking to any client really, but just because you mentioned Microsoft and I did my third gig with Microsoft last year, I asked them, and I would say there was about 100, let's call them senior leaders in the room. I'll actually just very quickly pivot to another session I did with Rolls-Royce, and it was my second session with Rolls-Royce. So you kind of can get the kind of level of people. So 150 senior leaders, Rolls-Royce, 100 senior leaders at Microsoft. Same question I'm asking. Hands up in the room if you truly believe you're a world-class performer. That's the level of the question. Straight in, no kissing. That's the start of the session. And that's what we're going for. How many hands do you think went up in either room, Microsoft or in Rolls-Royce? Wow. I'll tell you, out of the Microsoft 100 people, none. In the Rolls-Royce session, there was one guy who kind of sitting, I've got one of these standing desks, so I'll put my elbow on it. He was kind of at his, sitting down at the desk, and he kind of put his arm up like that. And I'm like, you've kind of got half a world-class performer over here, but it's one person of 150. And I guess it's not for me to judge people. I suppose all of this thing, this whole topic and subject, and, I'm giving different opinions on it now because obviously you're asking me questions on it. But ultimately, what I'm sharing is not based on judgment, just more on observation. And I just find it fascinating that people who had to work at Microsoft, at Rolls-Royce, would not see themselves at that level. Because my question to follow up that first question was, what do you think people outside this building perceive you to be? And of course, with Microsoft, you're literally at the biggest company in the world, a $1 trillion company. It's absolutely revolutionized, not just business, it's how we operate in life. The fact that we're doing this, on the computer and virtual is just sort of sums it up. Same as Rolls-Royce. People perceive Rolls-Royce, and I appreciate Rolls-Royce sold their car manufacturing business a long time ago, but still the quality of Rolls-Royce is still the status symbol, and it's luxury, and it's, elite and world class and all the rest of it. And yet the people within the building don't see themselves like that.
I suspect,
but
Paul,
the funny thing is that
I was only going to emphasize, I suspect that the answers may have been different if people had answered that question privately. Do you think?
Possibly. That's why I said it's not a judgment thing, and why people put the hands up or why they didn't put the hands up is also open to interpretation and debate. And yet, I did say that before. I was like, "What's interesting? What do you think people think about that?" And one of the people in another session, wasn't out of those two companies, but in another session said, "Well, one of our values is to be modest and humble." And I went, "That's great. So you should. But can you be modest and humble and have incredible self-belief that you're a world-class performer?"
Paul, do you think if you stood up in front of a 17-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo, do you think he'd have put his hand up?
I don't think he would, because I think, and again, I obviously haven't met the guy when he played against him, but I think from all accounts, what I heard about him and the story goes is that as a 17, 18-year-old kid, he walked into the kind of the manager and assistant manager and all those kind of guys that he was working with, the kind of Rennie Mundelsteins and Alex Fergusons and all those guys, and basically went, "I want to be the best player in the world. Can you help me?" Now, that's a very, very different question and understanding of I am the best versus I know where I'm at and that's where I'm trying to get to. And of course, if he had the roadmap and this is how hard he's worked to get that and achieve it, it's amazing. And this is why I found it fascinating, because actually this information, we live in the information age. Of course, we're starting to move into the AI era, but ultimately we're living in an information age. You can find out how to do practically anything. All the information's out there of world class, how to get to the very top of pretty much any industry, how to do pretty much anything's on YouTube. So the roadmap and all the information's there. The difficulty is, and this is why it's interesting with Ronaldo, because he used to keep it secret, a bit like, I'm not telling anyone how I've done this to get to this level. And now he's gone, "Hey guys, this is what I do. This is what time I start. This is my day. This is all the things I do. This is how hard I work. This is what I've been doing for the last 20 years. Here's the roadmap. Be my guest if you want to try and do it." Because guess what? Most people don't have the ability to stick to that because it's just too damn hard.
Yeah. Okay, let's ask one final question before we move into our traditional quick fire conclusion, which I hope you will be very game for. But before that, just touching on the leadership work that you do, because you work with a lot of leaders. What's one belief or behavior that's holding most leaders back, even if they don't realize it, from your experience?
Good question. Hard to sum up. So to try and give you a one size fits all answer, it'd be hard to sum up. Probably one point that I would just consider is probably the biggest thing that the corporate world struggles with, And I think this is where the sporting world, we've really accelerated and really improved in this, and that's recovery. So the way I would explain that is, as much as I was in an elite performance environment for nearly 20 years, I didn't have to be performing at that elite level every single day or every minute of every day. So of course, when training happened, I had to be at my best and try and perform well in training. So you get picked on a Saturday, and of course, once the Saturday or match day comes, you have to perform at your best. But we very quickly, and especially over the 20 years I was in it, very quickly improved on the recovery, to the ice baths, to the food, to the warm down, to all of that. Although I will flag, we're absolutely horrendous in football at moving on mentally from things. But anyway, that's another conversation. We're brilliant at physical recovery. Mental recovery, we're still normally stuck a week ago. But anyway, but in the corporate world, it's the opposite. They're pretty much always on, whether it's an email thing, whether it's a message thing or a Slack or whatever way they're communicating. So not only are they almost always on, but they then have to be probably physically either in the office or working from like a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. 5 days a week. And then pick one of my clients like a KPMG or PwC. If they're doing a big merger acquisitions and they're getting like, I don't know, 100 million, $1 billion deal over the line, people are working 3 days solid, no sleep. It's literally all hands on deck. And then they'll finish on, say, the Wednesday. And then the Thursday morning, they'll go, right, here's another one. I want you to do it again by next week. So their downtime is terrible. So they have very, very little recovery, which is why I think the biggest struggle in the corporate world and why there is so much burnout is because they're really, really poor at recovering from that really high performance that they're capable of, but they're not very good at the other side.
You dangle a little carrot on mental recovery. Maybe we'll have to leave that for a part 2. It feels too meaty a subject to push you to give a 30-second summary of everything you know and understand by mental recovery. Unless you'd like to give us a soundbite on what you mean by it, just as a way to round off without going too deep.
Let's just say, I don't know, let's say Dan had an opportunity to win a game in the last minute. I'm sure this has never happened, and failed miserably. And not only did he, let himself down, let the team down, the fans and everything, absolutely gutted. Most players that I've met are not going back into the changing room and start eating the food and going into the ice baths, and physically the recovery started probably within a second of the final whistle going physically. But how long do you think it might take I don't know, not to put words in your mouth, Dan, but let's say any player who's gotten that opportunity messes it up. How quickly do you think they're moving on within a second of the final whistle? Or are they still hanging on to that by Sunday, Monday, sometimes even the following week's training or whatever?
It's like I said, it probably is too much for today, but we may have to try and get you back, Paul, because I do think I'm with you on that. I do think that different characters, different players, different personalities, there will be a difference in time scale on each individual, and what team you play in, and how well you're designed, or how well the team is designed to cope with and almost treat failure and success the same. I think that makes a big difference as well. So yeah, I think that this could be well be a part 2. But shall we jump into a couple of lighter hearted quick fire rounds, Paul? If you're happy enough.
So this has been very deep for the last start.
Has. Okay, well, why don't I start it off? This is one I tend to ask most guests. If you were going to go to any sporting event, what would be on your bucket list? So it could be the Super Bowl, Monaco Grand Prix, whatever it is. What would be your bucket list one?
Have both those, please. That would be lovely.
Yeah.
I've just been a massive NFL fan for a long time, since in the 80s, watching the fridge for the Chicago Bears, and all the way through to obviously all my family are in Boston, so of course I'm a Pats fan, and seeing what Tom Brady and Belichick did for all those years. So yeah, it's got to be a Super Bowl, even if it's just for the halftime show.
Nice one. Okay, name 3 athletes across any sports, dead or alive, who you admire and love to watch.
Federer, just absolute poetry in motion. I actually read these little books called Little People, Big Dreams to my daughter, and I just read one last night about Pele, and I'm like,
Yeah, I know that
oh
series.
my goodness, imagine do that. And then let's think of something else. He's not dead, but again, American sports, just because he was so fascinating, still fascinate him, especially during lockdown when I watched The Last Dance. It's got to be watching Jordan in his prime. I think that just would have been just remarkable.
I have to say, that would have been, looking at that documentary, that would have been pretty special, wouldn't it?
Yeah, just one of a kind.
Yeah, absolutely. What was your favorite or happiest childhood memory, Paul, that you can think of?
Oh, so many. Just honestly, I probably didn't put it into context, or maybe should have just given the little caveat at the end of growing up in Belfast in the 70s and 80s and 90s. As much as there was all this stuff happening, and you'd be out in the street playing with your mates, and then suddenly like a bomb would go off less than half a mile from you, and you'd all stop and listen and go, "Wonder where that is," and you carry on playing. And it was just that dichotomy of absolute madness and chaos going on, and living in an unbelievably, loving, supportive household who you just, and again, without sort of looking back at rose tinted glasses, where you literally went outside your door and just played football with your mates in the street all day long, which is why I genuinely feel like, and I say this so many times, especially when I'm starting a speaking gig, I genuinely feel like the luckiest guy in the world. Because I'm just talking about that growing up in Belfast and kicking a ball around with my mates for free for 16 years. And then the next day I'm on a boat over to see, well, not literally a boat, but on the plane across the Spurs to play with Jurgen Klinsmann. And then my first boss was Alan Sugar. And he's like, can we pay you some money to kick a ball around with your friends? And I'm like, yeah, that's great. And then you make your Premier League debut, and then Sugar's like, you're not fired yet, but can we give you another 6-figure contract to kick a ball around your friends? And then I'm like, brilliant. Then when they did fire me, although he didn't say you're fired, and then I moved up to Norwich, and of course you have Delia Smith there, and then she's like, Paul, can we pay you some more money to kick a ball around your friends? And I'm like, this is unbelievable. It's different. And then now, for the last 15 years, I've been getting paid to talk about kicking a ball around with my mates, and I'm like, wow, does it get any better than that? And as my mum says, when are you going to get a real job?
Yeah. Dan's about to find out.
My sister says that to me all the time.
Yeah, well, it's true. But of course, we know just how hard it is, which I know that you're not at that stage yet. But whenever I stop playing, and I've had this conversation so many times, and people are like, why did you stop at 32? Why did you walk away when you just won a league title with Norwich City? And why did you, what was the reason? And ultimately, I'm like, trying to explain, doing this for so long is a bit like running a marathon every single day. And then when the day comes and you stop, or I decided to stop playing, and then the next day you wake up and you're like, one eye kind of half open, and you're like, do I have to run a marathon today? No. Oh, thank fuck for that. Because this is just the hardest thing in the world, to try and do this at that level against the best athletes in the world and put yourself through it for so long and be in that mindset for so many decades is unbelievably difficult. And I can't even imagine what it's like to be a rugby player, Dan, because I just had to try and be technically good. You're literally getting the shit kicked out of you every day for the last few years. And I'm like,
Yeah.
So that to me just shows how hard it is. So as much as it's good to kind of, joke and say it was kicking a ball around your friends, unbelievably tough at the same.
No, I understand exactly where you're coming from, Paul. But on behalf of myself and Daniel, thank you so much for today. It's been absolutely brilliant, and we'll definitely aim to try and get you back on for part 2, where we can put a little bit of meat on the bone on the mental side of it.
Well, no, brilliant. And so who should I send this invoice to? What's the best one after ours?
Daniel, definitely Daniel.
Dan Enterprises, Saint-Tropez. Pick it up.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate it.
So, what did you make of Paul? How did you enjoy that? What did you learn, Dan?
Well, it's hard for people who aren't seeing the visuals on this. The most impressive thing about that for the last hour or so was he was doing that standing up. It's like a standing up test. You could tell he's like a very well spoken or very well experienced keynote speaker. He was very much in full flow, wasn't he? But I just loved it. I loved how, like, the difference between standing in front of sort of Rolls Royce and Microsoft to playing against Cristiano Ronaldo to sitting in, Nigel Worthington's office, who, by the way, I'm not sure there's much love lost between the two of them there anyway.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating because I think for a lot of the listeners and a lot of our listeners and people who listen to the show, like Paul McVeigh is not a Alistair Cook or a Andrew Strauss or a Sia Khaleesi in terms of name and profile in their field. But I always find people like Paul who've gone on, who've had a stellar career, but have gone on to do extraordinary things in their post-sporting career and what he's doing in corporate world and business world now. So much value in what they say, isn't there? And there's so much detail and so much sort of ingredients to what he says. And it was really, really interesting.
I suppose there's that reflection that, most kids would be kind of biting your arm off at the idea of being able to train and hang out with the likes of Klinsmann and Sheringham and all those big stars and sort of Sol Campbell. But the reality is you come over from Northern Ireland age 17 and you're sort of shitting your pants. I don't know whether you had, you mentioned Shane Williams, but I suppose in your early days, whether it's at Swansea, you're coming into a dressing room full of adults and you're kind of going, what? These are the guys I've been watching on TV, and it's not kind of always the dream that you might imagine it to be.
Yeah, I remember that my first day in Wales camp back in 2008, and we had you had guys like Gethin Jenkins, Martin Williams, who I shared a room with for my first night in Wales camp, and you sort of feel like, you almost feel like you don't belong there, and I think I kind of got that from what Paul was saying. Like I didn't expect to be as good as those guys at that stage. You know what I mean? And I kind of got that. But I think I always had the ambition and the mindset of being, I'm going to be, or I believe I'm going to be as good as those guys and things. So
didn't turn out too badly. All right. Not too badly. I think we can say that now that we're at the end, now that you're at the end of that road. But listen, before we go, we should, of course, say to remind all our listeners and viewers to like, subscribe, follow the podcast wherever you listen to it. Tell your mates, because, Dan and I hugely value your support, and all your little nudges and encouragement help us keep bringing you these great conversations. Dan, is that fair?
I think that's fair. We've been very, very lucky to have some brilliant guests on. So the more likes, the more subscribes, the more listeners, the more views we get, the better guests, and we can keep the same quality of guests, which has been pretty high to keep to at the minute. But that's going to help a long way. So keep subscribing, keep liking, and keep listening.
Absolutely. If you don't listen to me, listen to him. Great. All right, Dan. Lovely to see you. See you next time.
Cheers, Daniel.